Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we'll continue our reading of Summer at Fairacre by Miss Reed. We've just been discussing the fact that Miss Reed's neighbor, Arthur Coggs, is going away for a little while for a stay in prison. There was general sympathy in the village for Arthur's wife, although it was agreed that by this time she must be inured to any discomfort caused by her husband's absences from home. Mr. Willett was more forthright. "She's far better off without that good-for-nothing round the house. He's not above giving her a walloping when he's worse for drink, and I reckon it's a dog's life when he's about." "I suppose she'll be worse off financially, though," I suggested. Mr. Willett snorted. "She gets the same handout as anyone else, plus the children's allowances, which ain't to be sneezed at in that Coggs family. And she's got a little bit of cleaning at the vicarage, and I know for a fact she brings home some pretty tasty bits of leftovers, what the partridges give her. She had a basin of beef dripping last Thursday as fair made my mouth water. Lovely that'd be on toast with a sprinkle of salt. I told her so, and she said she'd try it on the kids. Now, wouldn't you have thought she'd have known that anyway? The poor feckless body she is. My Alice tries to give her a few tips, like getting bones and simmering 'em with a few root veg, but she still goes on buying 'em great packets of cornflakes for 3 times the price." I sympathized with good, kind-hearted Mrs. Willett. I, too, am constantly casting my pearls before swine. How many of the poems I offer my children carry any weight beside the comics they devour? I like to think that an occasional felicitous phrase will stick and one day give them pleasure to recall. One must live in hope as a teacher or go under forever. Although Mrs. Coggs' plight was a familiar one, I somehow could not put the little family out of my mind after these 2 conversations. Joseph and his younger twin sisters seemed unmoved by this latest disaster, and as they were the only children of school age, I had little idea of how the younger ones were faring. There were 2 toddlers and a weakly-looking baby which seemed to spend its time in a battered pram which smelled overpoweringly of ammonia and disintegrating plastic fabric. In many ways, poor, apathetic Mrs. Coggs had much in common with Mrs. Pringle's crazy niece, Minnie. Both had a tribe of neglected children. Both lived in a state of dirt and muddle. Both had trouble with their menfolk, and neither seemed to have any idea of managing money, as Mrs. Willett had discovered. If anything, Minnie was less to be pitied. Despite her turbulent domestic life, she seemed to enjoy the excitement of 2 men competing for her favors at the same time. Her bevy of noisy, wet-nosed children did not seem to ruffle her. The wide, mad grin stayed permanently on her freckled face. She could not read nor tell the time, relying on the chimes of St. Patrick's Church to give her a rough idea of the passage of the hours or the arrival of the Caxley bus, when the village was fortunate enough to have such a convenience. But she always seemed to find life utterly absorbing and pleasurable, living as she did in the present. With her limited intelligence, the past was soon forgotten, and what lay in the future was beyond her comprehension. In some ways, one could almost envy Minnie's dotty euphoria. She seemed immune to remorse or apprehension. Mrs. Coggs was only marginally more intelligent, but was much more pathetic. She certainly remembered the past and lived in fear of her husband's violence, knowing only too well from experience what terror and damage he could cause when drunk. Lack of money and utter hopelessness contributed to her neglect of the children, and any attempts to help her met with overpowering apathy, as the local probation officer could testify. Mrs. Coggs had once been discovered shoplifting, and the time she had spent under supervision from the probation service had certainly given some help and direction to the family, but once that had gone, the same slipshod ways returned. Perhaps, as Mr. Willett had said, the departure of Arthur to the care of Her Majesty's prison might well give his pathetic wife some relief. Time alone would tell. Elizabeth Maughan was still away from home, and no one seemed to have any news of her. Henry spoke of her quite cheerfully, and with no hint of there being anything untoward in the circumstances. Perhaps he was accustomed to his wife's absences, as Miriam had told me. He had called again, so Mr. Willett informed me, but luckily I had gone to see Amy, who lived some miles south of Caxley in the village of Bent, so that I missed him. He's got a great roll of books with him, Mr. Willett informed me. Books, I took it, meant magazines. It is the common term here for anything printed. I was just congratulating myself on my timely absence from home on that particular evening when my caretaker sent my hopes plummeting. I was oiling that dratted lock on the lobby door, and I says I should take the books for you, but Mr. Maughan said he'd come again another time. He could have left them in the porch. Well, he never, did he? Strikes me as he wants an excuse to pay you another visit. Seems he's a bit lost without his missus. Confound the fellow, I thought. However, no point in making a fuss about it, and certainly no need to let Mr. Willett see how annoyed I was. It would be all over the village in no time. I gave Mr. Willett what I imagined was a carefree smile. Nice to see the hedges beginning to show green, I observed, casually changing the subject. I wouldn't encourage him if I was you, said Mr. Willett. He was gone before I could reply, perhaps just as well. But the slight irritation caused by Henry Maughan was overwhelmed in the bliss of breaking up. All teachers are glad to welcome the end of term, and particularly the end of the winter term when the weather is at its most bitter, playtimes have to be spent indoors, pupils and staff are suffering coughs, colds, and worse afflictions, and tempers are short. To add to our general happiness, the sun shone warmly, the little birds fluttered about their nest building and egg hatching, and a few early tulips ventured into flower. What could be more hopeful? We set about tidying up the classroom in the afternoon. Desks were relieved of mountains of used paper, the flower vases were emptied and washed, pencils and pens collected, textbooks and exercise books stacked in the cupboards so that the time soon came when the children had nothing to occupy them. And we were back to simple games such as I Spy and Left and Right. This invaluable aid to teachers consists of holding a piece of chalk in one or the other hand, then holding out the two fists, naming a child, and then displaying one's open palms. If the child chosen has guessed correctly, it is his turn to come to the front and continue. That such an unsophisticated game should give so much pleasure does one's heart good these days. At 3:30, we heard the scraping of chairs as the babies, beyond the partition between our two rooms, prepared to depart. Excited voices were upraised in grace. Miss Briggs' stentorian tones preceded a general exodus toward their lobby, and silence fell. The massive wall clock ticked ponderously. Outside, a robin chattered, scolding the infants, no doubt. Patrick stood, fists outstretched, trying to decide who should have the honor of guessing left or right. "Eileen," he said at last, breaking the spell. "Right," she said, and it was. "Last turn," I said, one eye on the clock. The usual groans of dismay assailed me. "But, miss, I ain't had no turn yet. Eileen Burton's been twice. It's not fair. The girls have had more'n us boys." "Does anyone want to stay in after school?" I inquired politely. Silence fell. Eileen fiddled with the chalk behind her back. After a lengthy pause, she held out her two fists. "Joseph," she said. "Left," croaked Joseph in his hoarse little voice. "Well done," I said. "Now you remember, Joseph, next time we play that it's your turn to start." "It'll be next term, miss," he pointed out. It was a joyous thought. All stand, hands together, eyes closed. We sang grace somewhat discordantly and rather faster than usual, but we were truly thankful, every one of us. Later that evening, I pottered about happily in my house and garden, savoring the joy of the first few hours of the Easter holiday. Now I need not watch the clock. I could have my breakfast later than usual. I could dally in the bath. Who knows, I might even get round to washing the curtains. Mrs. Pringle, no doubt, would soon be badgering me about spring cleaning on her weekly visit to the schoolhouse. The fever hits her early. I am fast becoming immune to it as the years pass, and I have pointed out frequently to my tyrant that if the house is cleaned regularly and occasionally bottomed, as she puts it, which means a ghastly upheaval, then surely spring cleaning is not necessary. I lose this battle every time, as I know I shall from the outset. The day will come when I return from school to find the shabbily comfortable chairs stripped of their chintz covers and Mrs. Pringle confronting me with handfuls of debris she has collected from the cracks, such as peanuts, pencils, knitting needles, and once a lipstick of Amy's, which thankfully had not shed its lid. But so far nothing had been said about our annual upheaval, and in my present buoyant mood I was hopeful. Perhaps she'd forgotten. Perhaps the renowned bad leg was in one of its combustible moods, and when this afflicted limb flares up, as its owner puts it, any activity is severely restricted. It can work to my advantage occasionally, as in this case. I woke the next morning to blue skies and a wonderful sense of freedom. Lying back on my pillows, watching the unfurling pink tiny leaves of the copper beech fluttering in the morning breeze, I made plans for my first day of the holidays. I should cook myself bacon as well as an egg. Usually a boiled egg is the standard school day breakfast. While it boils, I can rush about watering pot plants, emptying the tidy bin, putting tea towels to soak, and generally getting ahead with essential daily chores. Today, I should stand at my ease, turning bacon in a leisurely fashion and enjoy its aroma. Tibby should have bacon rinds, a particular treat, and we would both celebrate. Then I should settle down with the crossword puzzle. It is surely the height of luxury to do the crossword puzzle early in the day. It seems so delightfully decadent when normally one is at work. I should take my time over a little flower arranging. I might clean the upstairs windows. I might ring Amy and invite her to tea. In fact, the day spread before me full of enchanting small ploys which I might or might not do. No timetable threatened me, no inspectors would call, no children would disturb me. Oh, thrice blessed holidays! As might be expected, I was not allowed to live on these dizzy heights for long. Life always manages to pull the rug from under one's feet and bring one to earth with a bump. I certainly enjoyed my bacon and egg, and I was happily settled with the crossword at 9:15 when the postman delivered an electricity bill of horrifying size, a pamphlet from an animal rescue society with a distressing photograph of an emaciated dog, which I knew would haunt me for nights to come, and a postcard from Henry Maughan requesting the pleasure of my company at a sherry party. He had added, "Do come, love Henry," which I thought quite unnecessary and particularly thoughtless, for he must have known, as well as I did, that Mr. Lamb at the post office, as well as the postman, would have read it with extreme delight. What an irritating fellow he was. I should certainly decline, and without love. But these were minor pinpricks. Worse was to come. I was enjoying a rest in the garden. There is a sheltered spot at the back of the house where the sun warms one comfortably and there is no wind. My peace was disturbed by the arrival of Mrs. Pringle and her niece Minnie with a retinue of grubby children. For one awful minute I envisioned a dreaded spring cleaning, but Mrs. Pringle soon put me right. "Minnie's Basil's got to go up to the hospital in May," she indicated a minute boy with his mother's tousled red hair, freckles, and a much-bandaged hand. "She was wondering if the school ones could come for the day, as I've offered to look after the lot while she's up there. Never know what time you'll get back from those places, do you? I mean, everyone's appointment turns out to be for 10 o'clock, so you might be hanging around till midnight." I agreed hastily. May seemed a long way off. And in any case, if Mrs. Pringle was being so noble as to have that little tribe for the day, it was very small beer on my part to accommodate the older children in school. "Ain't you lucky?" cried Minnie to her offspring, who simply nodded owlishly without speaking. "And how is Basil's hand?" I was foolish enough to ask. Minnie grabbed it and was about to unwrap the grubby bandage. "Like to see it? Coming on nice it is." "No, no," I squeaked. I have no stomach for such horrors, and people like nurses who have to cope daily with such matters have my sincere respect. Minnie looked disappointed. Obviously, she considered it a privilege to be shown Basil's mutilated fingers. "I'm sure it's best to keep the wounds covered," I said weakly. "Germs and things, you know." "Quite right," said Mrs. Pringle with approval. "Well, that's all right then, Minnie. We'll be getting back for our tea now you've got things fixed up." I accompanied them to the gate. "By the way," said my cleaner, "about time we did a bit of spring cleaning." Chapter 5. Easter Holidays. Early in the holidays, Amy spent an evening with me. She arrived bearing a beautiful monogrammed suitcase containing contributions to our WI jumble sale. Only Amy, I thought, would pack jumble with so much tissue paper and in such an elegant container. Most of the stuff in the hall had been thrust into carrier bags or was wrapped in all-embracing old tablecloths or moth-eaten blankets tied up by the corners. A few choice specimens were on wire hangers and dangled from the curtain rods over the windows. Sorting was to take place the next afternoon, and Amy's things would certainly be quickly snapped up. I could foresee, and by helpers, if Mrs. Partridge did not keep a sharp eye on things. I suppose this craving to have the first pick is universal, and it certainly is at its strongest during preparations for bazaars, jumble sales, and the like. I often think it is a marvel that anything gets left to put out on the stalls, and I frequently see a handbag of mine in the village that went directly from my house to a helper in the stall, bypassing the jumble sale altogether. Mrs. Partridge, as a vicar's wife, is quite aware of human frailty and has made a sensible and practical rule. Helpers are allowed to buy one article, and only one, before the sale. That is their reward for the time and energy they put into the job. After that, they must muck in with the rest of us, milling about from stall to stall. I must say Mrs. Partridge's rule works well. Perhaps my handbag was the sole choice of its present owner as the helper's bonus. A charitable thought. "We'd better transfer it all to another case," I said. "Then you can take yours home with you." "Oh, don't bother, my dear. Leave it as it is, and I'll collect the case another time." "But suppose it gets nicked," I protested. "The vicar's coat was sold once in Mrs. Lamb's shopping basket. I couldn't bear to see this beauty rattling off in someone's van." "Don't be so pessimistic. Of course nothing will happen to it. You should have more trust in your fellows." "Well, if I have to tell you that it vanished when my back was turned, I hope you won't forget the gypsy's warning." "I promise not to blame you. There's quite enough to worry about, I find, without fussing about a suitcase." For one moment, I feared Amy was about to unburden her problems concerning James' absences from home, and my heart sank. I very much dislike being the recipient of secrets, particularly marital ones, but I need not have worried. "Do you find," asked Amy, settling back on the sofa, "that things prey on your mind more heavily as you grow older? I always imagined that it was only the young that suffered agonies over spots on the face or unrequited love, but really I seem to do nothing but plan against all sorts of horrors that may never occur." "How do you mean? Illnesses or accidents?" "Partly. I mean that I never take the car out without wondering if it will break down in some lonely spot. Then I rehearse what I should do if a convict on the run came up and threatened me. Should I give him my handbag without a struggle? Should I attempt to take the axe away from him? That sort of thing." "If he had an axe, I should give him anything he required," I answered. "More likely, of course," went on Amy, fitting a cigarette into a long, elegant holder, "is the business of finding oneself in a strange town with the car locked and one's keys and handbag still inside. Not to mention one's Mac and its pouring cats and dogs. I often think of that one." What a masochist you are. I had no idea you led such a lurid mental life. I don't enjoy it, confessed Amy, but I can't seem to control all this planning for trouble. Take this awful man, for instance. Which awful man? The one the Caxley Chronicle is full of these last few weeks. He's a positive nutcase, one of these wretched fellows who rings doorbells and then throws open his raincoat to the person who opens the door. Of course, he has nothing on, and very annoying it must be to be confronted like that when you are expecting the fish man. Well, you would shut the door and ring the police, surely? My dear girl, that's been done dozens of times, but they simply can't catch him. Actually, I've thought of an excellent plan if he comes to Bent. I'd better tell you, as this is just the sort of house he'd visit, and one really should be prepared. Thanks, I said. Very reassuring, I must say. I propose to keep a small jar of dye on the windowsill by the front door, and if there's any nonsense like that, I shall throw it all over him. How will that help? At least the police will be able to recognize him. I should use only vegetable dye. In fact, I've a little pot of green, which will do beautifully. Nothing to harm the poor fellow, as he's obviously non compos mentis, and will probably go straight from the magistrate's court to the loony bin. But I do advise you to do the same. 2 lots of dye are better than 1, and we should really be doing the public a service. She took a long pull at her beautiful cigarette holder and blew 2 perfect smoke rings. Then she looked at me sharply. Are you laughing? A great painful gale, which I had been trying to suppress, broke forth, and Amy joined me in a prolonged bout of refreshing giggles. Amy, I said, wiping my eyes, you'll be the death of me. More likely the awful man will be. I wonder what sets them off on this sort of caper. Frustrated passion, perhaps? But there are far more obvious ways of expressing frustrated passion. Suicide, for instance, or poetry. After all, some of the most telling poems have dealt with unrequited love. Do you remember those 2 rather nice young men we met at Cambridge years ago? Which ones? And did they suffer from frustrated passion? Over us, I hope? No. They just discussed poems about it. We all got rather cross, I remember. We were picnicking at Grantchester, and they were both at Trinity. Can't recall their names now, but they were in the Madrigal Society. Spotty, rather, but nice boys. They've completely vanished from in the mists of time for me, I confessed. But which poems did they recommend for sheer desperate longing of the beloved? One plumped for that little 16th century verse. Western wind, well, when wilt thou blow? The small rain down can rain. Christ, my love, if you were in my arms and I in my bed again. It is harrowing, isn't it? Hits the nail on the head, I agreed. But what did the other one suggest? He was all for Night and Day by Cole Porter, and after we'd played it on their portable gramophone about 10 times that afternoon, we were inclined to agree. She tapped ash from her cigarette and rose. Well, I must be off. Don't forget about the dye, darling, and good luck with the jumble sale. I must say, a few hours with you does me a world of good. I haven't giggled till all my ribs ached since before I was married. I expect marriage brought you to your senses, I said lightly, and then wished I had not spoken. I'm afraid it didn't do that, said Amy soberly. At the front door she kissed me, a rare occurrence between us, and I felt overcome with pity for her as I waved her farewell. Damn James. He must give her even more trouble than the awful man. Poor Amy. Well, we shall leave poor Amy to her inventive pot of dye and look further into April holidays next time.